The smell reached the corridor before anything else did. Frankincense burning in shallow bronze dishes, sweet and suffocating, the kind of perfume that does not mask the air so much as replace it entirely. And if you have ever stood inside a Roman palace at the hour before dawn, you understand that the darkness there is not ordinary darkness. It does not rest. It watches. It has weight. It presses against your skin like warm stone. And the boy who walked those corridors in the year 218 had not yet learned to stop feeling it, had not yet grown the second skin that palace-bred children eventually grow, the one that lets you move through political terror as though it is simply weather. And his name at that moment was Varius Avitus Bassianus, 14 years old, from the ancient Syrian city of Emesa, a priest of the sun god Elagabal. And he had just been told by the soldiers surrounding him that he was now the Emperor of Rome, which is a sentence that should produce joy in a child, and instead produced something far more complicated, something closer to the feeling of stepping onto a floor and discovering, too late, that the floor is not there, and the soldiers were not congratulating him so much as informing him, which is how Rome always delivered its most catastrophic news, as a simple statement of already completed fact, as a bureaucratic inevitability, and the boy who would be scraped out of history under the name Elagabalus stood in the torchlight of a military camp on the edge of the Syrian desert, the orange flame catching the heavy embroidered fabric of his priestly robes, the gold thread burning bright, and understood for the first time in his short life that beauty and captivity can be the same thing dressed differently, that the most elegant cage Rome ever built was not made of iron at all. It was made of ceremony, of silk, of the slow pressure of expectation that begins at the moment you are crowned, and does not release you until the moment you are dead, and often not even then. To understand what Rome did to this child, you have to first understand what he was before Rome got its hands on him, because the machinery of empire is most clearly visible in the transformation it forces, in the before and after, in the human being who existed prior to the system and the human being, or the remnant of one who emerged afterward. And Elagabalus before Rome was not yet a contradiction. He was a boy who danced, who genuinely danced, not as performance but as devotion, his body moving in slow ceremonial spirals around the great black conical stone of the sun god in the temple at Emesa. And the stone itself was extraordinary, a dark meteorite that the Syrians believed had fallen directly from heaven. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps the divine does sometimes fall to earth in the form of black rock, burning and indifferent. And the priests who served it, the boy among them, dressed in elaborate Eastern robes, their faces painted, their movements choreographed by generations of religious tradition that had nothing whatsoever to do with the straight military logic of Rome. And that is the first thing you need to hold in your mind, that this child came from a world of sacred ritual that was genuinely alien to Roman sensibility, a world where the body in motion was itself an act of prayer, where beauty was not frivolous but theological, where identity was fluid in ways that the Latin tongue did not even have adequate vocabulary to describe. And when Rome selected him as emperor, it was not despite these qualities. It was, in a sense, because of them, because his grandmother, Julia Maesa, one of the most coldly intelligent political operators the ancient world ever produced, had understood that the soldiers of the Third Gallican Legion could be made to believe that this beautiful dancing priest was the secret son of the previous emperor Caracalla, that his Syrian strangeness would read as exotic charisma, that the army would project onto him whatever emperor they needed to see. Because soldiers are not so different from anyone else in that they often see not the person standing before them, but the idea they require that person to represent. And Julia Maesa handed the army the idea of an emperor, and the army took it without looking too closely at the boy underneath. The march to Rome took months, and if you close your eyes and try to inhabit the texture of those months, you arrive at something extraordinary. A procession moving slowly through the Mediterranean world, with all the ceremony of a triumph and all the psychological weight of a sentence being carried to its execution. The boy emperor at its center, already beginning to understand that he had been chosen not for who he was, but for what he could be made to mean. And somewhere in those months between Syria and Rome, something shifted in him, some early realization crystallized, that the people surrounding him, his grandmother, her advisors, the generals, the palace functionaries, who had materialized around him like flies around something sweet. None of them were particularly interested in the priest child who loved his God with genuine devotion and danced in the morning light of the temple. They were interested in the emperor shape, in the political vessel, and they were already in the process of deciding what to put inside it, which is a particular form of violence that leaves no visible wound and does not appear in any official record. The violence of being made into a symbol while still having the misfortune of also being a person. And Rome was very skilled at this particular violence, had been practicing it for centuries, had refined it to something almost elegant. The way certain poisons are elegant, the way the smile of someone who has already decided to destroy you is elegant. Rome itself received him in the summer of 219, and the city's first impression of its new emperor was the procession, which was not a Roman procession, which was the point, which was the problem. The boy wearing Eastern robes of purple and gold that swept the ground, his face painted in the Syrian priestly manner. The black stone of Elagabal carried before him in a chariot drawn by white horses with the reins arranged so that the god appeared to be driving himself. And the Roman crowd, which had seen everything, which believed it had long ago exhausted its capacity for surprise, fell into a silence that was not reverent but stunned. The particular silence of a population encountering something so genuinely outside its categorical system that it cannot immediately decide whether it is witnessing something sacred or something offensive. And the answer, they would eventually decide, was both. But at that first moment, there was only the silence, and the sound of the horses, and the smell of the burning incense that drifted back from the procession in waves, and the boy at the center of it all, 14 years old, walking through the capital of the world, in a body that the world had already decided it owned, his eyes moving across the crowd with an expression that ancient sources describe variously as serene and as terrified, which are, in certain extreme circumstances, precisely the same expression. What happened in Rome over the next 4 years is recorded in sources that must be handled with extreme care, because the historical record of Elagabalus is not a neutral document. It is a political assassination conducted in ink. It is the written equivalent of what Rome would eventually do to his body, a systematic destruction carried out by men who needed his memory to be monstrous, so that his murder could be called justice. And you must hold this awareness constantly as you read, must understand that the Historia Augusta, the primary source for his reign, is a text saturated with political purpose, that the allegations within it were crafted to delegitimize, and yet, beneath the obvious fabrications and the hostile editorializing, there is something real that keeps surfacing, something that no amount of political distortion can entirely obscure. And it is this: a young person who refused, with what can only be described as remarkable and ultimately fatal consistency, to be the emperor Rome had decided it needed, who kept insisting on being, instead, something Rome had no category for, and this insistence was not, as the sources suggest, the random perversity of a mad tyrant. It was something stranger and more significant than that. It was the persistence of a self that the empire had failed to fully extinguish, the continued presence of Varius inside the costume of Caesar, and Rome would not forgive him for it. Rome never forgives anyone for surviving its attempts at transformation, because survival implies that the transformation failed, and Rome could not afford to appear to have failed. The religious program was the first battleground, and it tells you everything about the collision that was occurring. Because Elagabalus genuinely believed in his god, genuinely believed that the black stone of Elagabal was the supreme deity of the universe, and that Jupiter, Mars, the whole marble column pantheon, should be subordinated to it. And this was not political theater. This was not the calculated religious syncretism of an Augustus or a Constantine managing belief as a tool of governance. This was a 14-year-old priest with genuine faith attempting to restructure the religious cosmology of the most powerful empire on earth according to his actual convictions, which is either the bravest thing a person can do or the most catastrophically naive, and perhaps it is both. And the Roman aristocracy watched the sacred objects of their oldest temples being moved to accommodate the primacy of a Syrian meteorite, with the expression of people watching someone set fire to their own house and call it illumination, and the senators who attended the new rituals. And attendance was not optional. The system of expected compliance that Rome had perfected over centuries worked in all directions, including toward those who nominally wielded power, stood in their togas in the smoke-thickened air of foreign ceremony, and felt the particular humiliation of the powerful who have been made to bow, the kind that does not produce resignation, but murderous patience, the willingness to wait. Now pause here, in this smoke, in this waiting, and consider what it means that this history has survived to reach you, that these buried layers of empire and identity and institutional violence are accessible at all. And if you find yourself pulled toward this kind of excavation, toward histories that do not explain themselves politely, but instead open beneath you, like trap-doors into the actual architecture of power, then you belong in the ancestral archive, where the research goes deeper than any single documentary can carry it, where the threads connecting ancient Rome to the psychology of every institution that has followed it are still being pulled, still unraveling, still revealing. And if you want to descend further, the channel is there, the archive is open, and what waits inside it will not leave you the same way you arrived. The question of identity is where this story becomes not simply a historical curiosity, but something that reaches across 17 centuries and closes its hand around your throat. Because the ancient sources tell us, in language designed to horrify, that Elagabalus expressed what we would now recognize as a gender identity that was not male, that he asked physicians whether it was possible to surgically create a female body, that he wore wigs and makeup and women's clothing not in the context of the Dionysian gender fluidity that Rome occasionally tolerated as theatrical excess, but persistently and apparently sincerely, that he referred to his husband, a chariot driver named Hierocles, as his lord and master, that he called himself not emperor but empress, and the sources present all of this as evidence of madness, of depravity, of the fundamental unfitness for rule that justified everything that came after. And you are meant to read it and nod, meant to absorb the framing, meant to understand that what is being described is monstrous, but if you sit with it without the framing, if you read it as description rather than indictment, what you find is a young person, still a teenager for much of this, navigating the most hostile possible environment for any expression of non-conforming identity, doing so not in hiding but in the full glare of the imperial court, doing so with what the sources call shamelessness, but which might more accurately be called a kind of terrifying courage, The courage of someone who has decided that, if they are going to be destroyed, they will at least be destroyed as themselves. And Rome could not process this. Rome had elaborate systems for accommodating the eccentricities of power, for looking away from emperors who were cruel or sexually voracious or financially ruinous. But it did not have a system for an emperor who was sincerely something that the Latin language had no respectful word for, and so it reached for the tools it always reached for when confronted with the genuinely illegible. It reached for ridicule, and then, when ridicule proved insufficient, it reached for blood. Julia Maesa watched all of this with the cold clarity of someone who has built their entire edifice on a single foundation and is watching that foundation crack because she had installed Elagabalus as a political tool, and what she had gotten instead was a person, which is the miscalculation that haunts every political puppeteer, the discovery that human beings are not, in fact, infinitely moldable, that below a certain threshold of selfhood there is something that resists. And she began, with the careful efficiency that characterized everything she did, to prepare a replacement, to groom her other grandson, Alexander, for the succession, to begin the slow withdrawal of support from the boy she had elevated. And Elagabalus understood what was happening, because whatever else he was not stupid. He had survived 4 years in the most psychologically predatory environment in the ancient world, and survival requires a particular kind of intelligence, a sensitivity to the movement of loyalty, to the direction of wind in closed rooms, to the way people look at you when they have already decided you are past tense. And he tried to have Alexander killed, tried to dismiss the Praetorian Guard officers who had transferred their allegiance, tried to reverse the machine that was already in motion. But this is the nature of political machinery. It does not reverse, it does not yield to individual will. Once it has achieved sufficient momentum, it simply continues in the direction it was pointed. And what it was pointed toward was the end of Varius Avitus Bassianus, emperor, priest 18 years old. The Praetor Guard killed him in March of 222, and the manner of it matters. The manner always matters because execution is also communication, is also a message the system sends to itself about what it values and what it cannot tolerate. And what Rome communicated through the manner of this killing was the totality of its rejection, because his body was dragged through the streets, because the crowd that had once watched him process in golden robes now watched his corpse being hauled through filth, because attempts were made to stuff his body into a sewer, because the system that had dressed him in purple now stripped him of every dignity that can be stripped from flesh. And you sit with this, and you understand that this is not simply violence. This is the empire insisting on the last word, is the machine demanding acknowledgement that it was right, that the body it had tried to make into a symbol and failed had never been anything more than material to be disposed of. And the disposal had to be public, had to be humiliating, because anything less would have implied that the boy had mattered in ways that the empire was not prepared to admit, would have conceded that what it had destroyed was a person rather than a problem, and Rome was constitutionally incapable of making that concession. The historical memory did the rest of the work, and this is perhaps the most insidious part of the machinery, the part that operates not through direct violence, but through the architecture of narrative, through the control of who gets to describe what happened and in what language and for what purposes. Because the damnatio memoriae that followed Elagabalus was not simply the formal Roman procedure of erasing an emperor from official records. It was a comprehensive cultural project, a systematic rewriting conducted over generations by men who needed him to be a lesson, rather than a person, who needed his story to teach a specific moral, who found in his memory a useful warning about what happens when the body of empire is occupied by something too alien, too strange, too insistently itself. And so they wrote him as monster, as madman, as cautionary tale, and the writing worked so well that 17 centuries later, his name is still primarily associated with the allegations of excess and depravity, rather than with the theological project or the genuine political complexity of his reign or the simple biographical fact of a child who was handed an empire at 14 and did not survive to 20. And the writing still works because we still reach for the sources without remembering that the sources were written by his killers. What remains when you clear away the hostile editorializing is something genuinely heartbreaking in its simplicity. Something that has nothing to do with the grand sweep of imperial history and everything to do with the specific gravity of a specific human life, which is this. There was a boy who loved a god and danced for it in the early morning light of a Syrian temple, who was taken from that life by forces entirely beyond his control and placed at the center of a machine whose single function was to use human beings as fuel, and who spent 4 years trying to remain recognizably himself inside that machine, trying to keep some interior space that the system had not colonized, trying to be the priest inside the emperor, the person inside the symbol, and who failed not because he was inadequate, but because the machine was designed specifically to prevent exactly that kind of survival. And the tragedy is not that Rome destroyed him. Rome destroyed emperors routinely. The tragedy is the reason, is the fact that what Rome could not tolerate was not his cruelty or his military failures or his fiscal recklessness, but his refusal to be fully consumed, his insistence on the continued existence of a self that the system had not authorized. And this is not a problem that ended in 222 CE. This is a structure of power that did not die with Rome, that reappeared in every institution that followed it, that operates today in every system that demands the surrender of self as the price of belonging, that still reaches for ridicule and then for blood when it encounters the person who will not surrender, and the question it leaves you with, sitting in the silence after the torches have burned down, is not about Elagabalus specifically, but about the architecture itself, about the civilizations we have built that still require this particular sacrifice, still demand this particular consumption, still call the machine by the name of order and the consumed by the name of chaos. If you are still here, if these corridors have not released you yet, then you already know that the descent does not end at 222 CE, that the machinery this story describes did not stop when the empire fell, that the marble cracked and the smoke cleared, and the same system rebuilt itself in new materials and continued its work. And there are more doors in this archive than any single documentary can open, more buried histories that operate on the same principle of civilized consumption. And if you want to keep descending, if you understand that to know this history fully is not a morbid impulse but a necessary one, that the only way to recognize the machine is to have seen its oldest blueprints, then remain, subscribe, let the archive continue, because the torches are still lit and the corridors go deeper than you have yet gone. And what waits at the bottom is not horror, but clarity, which is more disturbing than horror, and more necessary, and more true.